It was a typical Wednesday evening in the Smith household. John, a successful software engineer, had just walked through the front door after a long day at work. His wife, Emily, was cooking dinner in the kitchen while their two young children, Jack and Lily, were doing their homework at the dining table. The house was quiet, except for the sound of sizzling food and the occasional laughter from the TV. But as John dropped his briefcase on the floor, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. And then he saw it: the back door, which was supposed to be locked, was wide open. Panic began to set in as he frantically searched for any sign of intruders. That's when he heard Emily's terrified scream from the kitchen. John rushed towards her and found two masked men holding her at gunpoint, their faces obscured by black ski masks that seemed to blend with the darkness. Jack and Lily were huddled behind a couch, their eyes wide with fear. John tried to assess the situation calmly, but his mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. Who were these men? What did they want? The family's phone had been ripped from the wall, leaving them cut off from any potential help. John's attempts at reason were met with aggressive demands from the intruders: hand over your valuables and get down on the floor. As the standoff continued, the family was forced to comply, their belongings tossed into a duffel bag as if they were worthless trash. But what happened next would change everything. In a split second, one of the masked men made a fatal mistake. It was a typical Wednesday evening in February 2010 for the Smith family. The sun had set over their quiet suburban neighborhood in San Diego, casting a warm orange glow over the streets and homes. But little did they know, a sense of tranquility would soon give way to chaos. John Smith, a 35-year-old software engineer, was on his way home from a late meeting at work when he received an unexpected phone call from his wife, Sarah. She sounded frantic, but John couldn't make out what she was saying. He rushed home, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed something was off. The front door was wide open, and the lights inside were flickering erratically. John's heart sank as he stepped out of the car and approached the house. That's when he saw them, two men in ski masks, armed with handguns, standing over his family. The intruders had apparently broken into the house through an unlocked basement window. They had been hiding in the shadows for at least 20 minutes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah and their two children, Emily and Jack, were being held captive on the living room floor, their hands bound behind their backs. The perpetrators, later identified as James Douglas and Michael Lee, seemed ruthless and well-organized. They were communicating with each other in a hushed tone, but it was clear they had no intention of letting anyone leave alive. As John watched in horror, one of the men stepped forward, his gun trained squarely on John's chest. As the Smith family was being held captive, the intruders began to make demands for cash and valuables. But it soon became clear that these men were not in it for the money. They seemed to be searching for something specific, rummaging through rooms and closets with an almost frantic intensity. The Smiths' 8-year-old son, Timmy, who had been forced to watch the ordeal from his bedroom, later recalled hearing one of the intruders shouting, "Where is it? Where is it?" over and over again. But what they were searching for remained a mystery, even as the night wore on. Police were alerted to the situation after a neighbor reported seeing two suspicious individuals lurking around the Smiths' property earlier that evening. Officers arrived at the scene just before 9 p.m., but their initial attempts to communicate with the hostages were met with hostility from the intruders. The standoff continued for several tense hours, with negotiators attempting to reason with the men and convince them to release the family unharmed. But as the night wore on, it became increasingly clear that something was off. The Smiths' daughter, Emily, who had been forced to watch her parents being held at gunpoint, later described the scene as like a nightmare come true. Despite their efforts to appear calm and composed, the intruders were becoming increasingly agitated. They began to argue with each other, their voices rising in anger as they seemed to realize that their demands would not be met. Meanwhile, detectives were working tirelessly to piece together the events of the night. They discovered that the Smiths' home had been broken into through a rear sliding glass door, which had been left open by the family's gardener earlier that day. It was a mistake that would prove costly. As the standoff entered its third hour, police were starting to suspect that this was no ordinary home invasion. There were signs of pre-planning and coordination, suggesting that these men may have been after something much more valuable than just cash or valuables. But what? As we've pieced together the events of that harrowing night, one question lingers in our minds: what drives a person to resort to such desperation? The Smith family's home invasion serves as a stark reminder that even in America's safest neighborhoods, darkness can fall at any moment. It's worth noting that the perpetrators, identified as 32-year-old Michael Jones and his accomplice, 25-year-old Sarah Lee, had no prior connection to the family. No motive, no grudge, just two individuals with a thirst for chaos. Their modus operandi was swift and calculated. They'd been casing homes in the area for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What's equally disturbing is that the Smiths' security system, which would have alerted authorities had it been functioning properly, was compromised due to a faulty Wi-Fi connection. This oversight allowed the intruders to slip under the radar and execute their plan with eerie silence. As we examine this case further, it becomes apparent that the Smith family's traumatic experience is far from an isolated incident. According to FBI statistics, home invasions have increased by 20% over the past decade, with California seeing a staggering 35% rise in reported incidents between 2010 and 2015 alone. The psychological toll on victims like Karen Smith cannot be overstated. Her subsequent testimony reveals a deep-seated fear of being trapped, even in her own home. The trauma experienced by families who've endured such ordeals is often a lifelong battle against anxiety and PTSD. Jones and Lee's sentences were meted out accordingly: 25 years for Michael Jones and 20 for Sarah Lee. However, the true cost of their actions will be felt long after they serve their time, as the Smith family continues to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. As the hours ticked by, the Smith family's worst fears seemed to be confirmed. The two masked intruders, later identified as 32-year-old Michael Martinez and 29-year-old Jorge Sanchez, had been in their home for what felt like an eternity. The police had been notified around 9 p.m., but it was now well past midnight and still no sign of the perpetrators. The family's young daughter, Emily, a 7-year-old who had been hiding under her bed throughout the ordeal, suddenly emerged from her hiding spot. Her terrified eyes met those of her mother, Sarah, as she stumbled towards her, begging to be held tight. The trauma etched on her small face was heartbreaking. Meanwhile, Michael Martinez had begun to exhibit increasingly erratic behavior, yelling at his partner to just get it over with, while Jorge Sanchez remained eerily calm, watching the family with a cold intensity in his eyes. As the standoff continued, Sarah's husband, John, couldn't help but wonder if they'd ever make it out of this alive. The Smiths' phone had been silenced by the intruders, but John managed to send a cryptic text message to their neighbor, pleading for someone to call 911 again. He hoped against hope that the authorities would get there in time, before something terrible happened. As the silence hung heavy over the scene, it seemed like an eternity until they heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with every passing moment. As the night wore on, the Smith family's terror reached a boiling point. Despite their desperate attempts to reason with the intruders, they were met with cold, calculating brutality. In a shocking turn of events, the masked men suddenly revealed their true intentions. They weren't there for valuables or ransom, but for something far more sinister. In a split second, one of the intruders snatched 7-year-old Emily from her mother's grasp, holding her at gunpoint as he demanded that Sarah hand over her purse. The scene was nothing short of chaos, with John frantically trying to protect his wife and daughter while also attempting to stall for time. But just when it seemed like the nightmare couldn't get any worse, a strange twist emerged. As the intruders began rummaging through the house, one of them suddenly froze, his eyes scanning the room as if he'd spotted something out of place. It was then that they noticed the security cameras, 2 discrete units installed by John just days prior. The men's faces contorted in rage and confusion, but it was too late. They had already made their move, leaving a trail of destruction and chaos in their wake.